Look at the terrifying, invisible reality of a global pandemic. For thousands of years, humanity was completely defenseless against the most ruthless predators on Earth. Diseases that could wipe out entire cities in a matter of weeks, leaving millions dead in their wake. The absolute greatest triumph of modern medicine, the exact moment human beings finally stopped acting like helpless prey, was the day we realized that these deadly plagues were not the wrath of God. They were not evil spirits. They were microscopic killers, passed silently from human to human through physical contact. When you picture the brilliant medical minds who first discovered the physical mechanics of contagion, the visionaries who built the absolute foundation of modern public health and epidemiology, who do you picture? You are taught to revere the European scientific revolution. You picture Girolamo Fracastoro in 16th-century Italy, miraculously writing the first theories on infectious diseases. You picture 19th-century European giants like John Snow tracking cholera in London, or Louis Pasteur in France proving the germ theory under a microscope. You are told that before the West finally woke up, the entire world was completely paralyzed by primitive medical superstition. We are taught that during the apocalyptic nightmare of the Black Death, humanity was completely blind, desperately sniffing flowers to ward off evil air, until the European mind alone possessed the clinical rationality to uncover the invisible mechanics of transmission. But the absolute foundational blueprint for epidemiology was not drafted in Renaissance Italy. The clinical, undeniable proof that diseases are transmitted from person to person through garments, vessels, and physical contact was not discovered by a 16th-century European physician. And the ultimate transition from medical superstition to the hard, empirical science of contagion was engineered over 200 years earlier, right in the terrifying epicenter of the bubonic plague, by an Andalusian physician in Islamic Spain. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the epidemiology heist, and how a 14th-century Islamic polymath actually discovered the mechanics of contagion. What follows is the story of a massive medical cover-up, and one of the most blatant acts of scientific erasure the Western medical establishment absolutely does not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who refuses to accept the heavily curated, highly sanitized historical narratives handed to you in school, if you want to know the actual, hidden pioneers of modern medicine, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us begin with the official timeline of public health, the version of medical history you were tested on, which meticulously paints Europe as the sole, undisputed pioneer of clinical rationality. According to the Western narrative, the story of medicine before the Renaissance was a dark age of extreme intellectual paralysis. For centuries, you are told, the greatest doctors in the world were completely trapped by a flawed ancient Greek concept called the miasma theory. The miasma theory dictated that all plagues and deadly diseases were spread by foul-smelling, corrupted air. If a city was struck by a pandemic, the medical establishment believed that a poisonous cloud of bad air had simply drifted into the streets, corrupting the bodies of anyone who breathed it in. Under this ancient dogma, there was absolutely no concept of human-to-human transmission. You did not catch a disease from your neighbor, you both just happened to breathe the same evil wind. This is exactly why the famous European plague doctors of the Middle Ages wore those terrifying bird-like masks. They stuffed the massive beaks with dried flowers, herbs, and strong spices, genuinely believing that if they could just block the bad smell of the corrupted air, they would be completely immune to the Black Death. Furthermore, the European medical establishment was heavily dominated by absolute religious fatalism. When the Black Death arrived in Europe, wiping out a third of the continent, the prevailing narrative from the authorities was that the plague was a divine punishment. It was an unstoppable curse sent from the heavens to punish the wicked, and trying to avoid it or understand its physical mechanics was a violation of divine will. The Western textbook claims that this desperate, terrifying medical blindness choked human survival until the miraculous dawn of the European intellectual awakening. Suddenly, the narrative claims, the European mind breaks free from the Dark Ages. In the 1540s, an Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro publishes a revolutionary text. He completely rejects the bad air theory. He proposes that diseases are actually caused by tiny, invisible particles called spores that can be transferred between people through direct contact, through clothing, or through the air. The West completely crowns itself. Europe boldly declares that the monumental transition from the terrifying superstition of bird masks and divine curses to the sophisticated clinical reality of epidemiology is the pure, unadulterated invention of the Western mind. They draw a straight, unbroken line from the primitive ignorance of the ancient world directly to the Italian Renaissance and Victorian France. completely ignoring a massive, glaring, centuries-long gap in the timeline of human survival. But if you actually dig into the historical medical archives, if you look at the clinical observations recorded centuries before the Italian Renaissance, and if you read the exact Arabic medical texts detailing the precise transmission of the plague through physical contact, contaminated clothing, and shared drinking vessels, that beautiful, isolated narrative of Western medical genius completely shatters. To find the true pioneer of epidemiology, we have to completely abandon the prestigious medical universities of Renaissance Europe. We have to travel back in time, directly into the jaws of the apocalypse. We have to travel to the year 1348, to the highly advanced, incredibly desperate landscape of the Emirate of Granada in Islamic Spain. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept across the Mediterranean like a tidal wave of unimaginable destruction. It did not care about borders, religions, or empires. It annihilated entire populations in a matter of days. The streets of Granada, a magnificent city of scholars, poets, and scientists, were suddenly filled with the dead and the dying. The fear was absolute. And operating directly inside this nightmare, watching his civilization collapse around him, was a brilliant Andalusian physician, historian, and statesman named Lisan al-Din ibn al-Khatib. Ibn al-Khatib was completely surrounded by the exact same religious fatalism and Greek miasma theories that paralyzed the European doctors. The religious scholars of his time were loudly declaring that the plague was a divine decree, that human beings could not infect one another, and that fleeing the infected areas was an insult to God. The traditional doctors were burning incense and blaming the wind. But Ibn al-Khatib was a man of uncompromising, hard, empirical science. He looked at the devastating spread of the bubonic plague. He looked at how the disease was actually moving through the neighborhoods of Granada. And he realized that the religious scholars and the ancient Greeks were completely, catastrophically wrong. He refused to rely on ancient dogma while his people bled to death. Driven by a massive, perception-altering clinical epiphany, Ibn al-Khatib began the very first rigorous, empirical study of human epidemiology. He did not look at the sky. He did not smell the air. He looked directly at the patients. He began to meticulously track the path of the infection. He realized that the Black Death was not a random, invisible cloud of bad air descending on a city to punish the wicked. It was a highly specific, highly traceable chain of death. He noticed that when a person died of the plague, the people who washed their body immediately contracted the disease. He noticed that the people who inherited and wore the clothes of the dead, or even just touched their garments, were struck down days later. He documented that people who drank from the exact same water vessels as the infected were guaranteed to die, while those who used separate vessels in the very same rooms survived. This was not bad air. This was direct, physical, human-to-human transmission. To prove this massive, perception-shattering theory, Ibn al-Khatib needed absolute, undeniable empirical evidence. So, he looked at the anomalies. He looked at the populations that were miraculously surviving the apocalypse while the rest of the world burned. He documented that the nomadic Bedouin tribes, who lived completely isolated in the desert and had absolutely no physical contact with the infected cities, remained completely untouched by the plague. Even more astonishingly, he looked inside the massive, crowded prisons of the royal palace in Granada. By all accounts of the ancient Greek miasma theory, a crowded, foul-smelling, subterranean dungeon should have been the absolute epicenter of the corrupted air. It should have been a mass grave. But Ibn al-Khatib noted that because the prisoners were entirely cut off from the outside world, because they had no physical contact with infected citizens or their contaminated garments, the plague never breached the prison walls. They were completely, flawlessly immune. Driven by this flawless clinical data, in the mid-14th century, right in the terrifying heart of the Black Death, Ibn al-Khatib sat down and wrote his monumental medical treatise on the plague. Inside this document, he achieved something that completely destroys the official timeline of Western medicine. He explicitly, undeniably defined the scientific concept of contagion. He wrote, and I quote the historical record directly, "The existence of contagion is established by experience, study, and the evidence of the senses, by trustworthy reports on transmission by garments, vessels, earrings, and by the immunity of isolated individuals." He went even further, directly and aggressively attacking the religious fatalists of his own society, who refused to believe in contagion. He declared that when religious dogma contradicts the absolute, undeniable physical evidence of the senses and clinical observation, the dogma must be completely rejected. He stated that it was a profound insult to God and human reason to ignore the physical reality of how the disease was actually spreading. Let the absolute magnitude of that medical realization sink in. He had just explicitly mapped out the exact, flawless clinical definition of epidemiology. He had just identified what modern scientists call fomites, inanimate objects like clothing, jewelry, and cups that carry and transmit infectious pathogens. He completely stripped the superstitious, invisible magic out of the plague. He proved that to stop the apocalypse, you did not need to wear a bird mask stuffed with flowers, and you did not need to pray for the bad air to leave. You needed to physically quarantine the infected and burn their clothes. He was utilizing the exact empirical framework of public health and infection control that Girolamo Fracastoro and Louis Pasteur would claim to have miraculously invented centuries later in Europe. So, a massive, terrifying question emerges for the defenders of the European scientific revolution and the birth of modern medicine. If the exact mechanics of contagion, human-to-human transmission, and the clinical observation of fomites were all perfectly established, documented, and actively written down in Islamic Spain during the 14th century, how did the physicians of Renaissance Italy get all the credit? How did the West successfully execute this massive medical cover-up, claiming they invented the science of epidemiology out of thin air? To answer that terrifying question, we have to completely dismantle the myth of the isolated European medical awakening. We have to look at the massive, highly organized, and deliberately obscured academic translation network that bridged the Islamic world and the European Renaissance. You are taught that the Renaissance was a closed intellectual loop. You are told that in the 16th century, Western doctors simply woke up, took off their primitive bird masks, and spontaneously invented the concept of contagion in the prestigious universities of Padua and Florence. The Western narrative violently insists that the architecture of modern medicine is a purely European invention, completely untainted by the outside world. But the academic and medical reality of the Mediterranean destroys that myth completely. During the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, European medical schools were absolutely desperate for advanced clinical knowledge. They knew their ancient Greek texts were failing them, and their populations were dying. So they heavily, aggressively translated massive Arabic medical encyclopedias into Latin. For centuries, the medical curriculum of the greatest early European universities was almost entirely dominated by the translated works of Islamic physicians. And the intellectual output of Islamic Spain, the very epicenter where Ibn al-Khatib wrote his groundbreaking treatise on the plague, was actively bleeding into the rest of Europe. The physical texts, the clinical observations, and the heavily documented theories of contagion did not just disappear when the Black Death subsided. They circulated, they were copied. They were read by the elite medical scholars of the Mediterranean. When Italian physicians like Girolamo Fracastoro began to formulate their supposedly groundbreaking theories on physical transmission in the 1540s, they were not starting from scratch. They were operating in an intellectual environment that had already been deeply saturated by the translated medical genius of the Islamic Golden Age. They saw the clinical observations regarding garments, shared vessels, and physical contact. They read the exact empirical methodologies that proved isolation prevented infection. And they did exactly what the Western medical establishment would do for centuries to come. They took the exact clinical framework of physical transmission, the exact observations of contaminated garments and shared vessels, and they directly integrated them into the European medical consciousness. But as Europe emerged from the devastation of the plague and moved toward the Renaissance, the Western academic and political establishments had a major, terrifying ideological problem. They were actively engaged in the Reconquista, the violent, centuries-long military campaign to conquer the Emirate of Granada, expel the Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, and establish absolute Christian dominance. They were actively building an entire intellectual identity based on the absolute supremacy of the white, European mind. They were aggressively branding the Islamic world as a civilization of backward, primitive fanatics. They could not publicly admit that the greatest, most life-saving, most profound medical breakthrough in the history of human survival was actually engineered by a Muslim physician operating in the very Andalusian kingdom they were trying to destroy. It would completely shatter their fragile, supremacist narrative of Western medical and intellectual exceptionalism. So, they engaged in a deliberate, highly calculated process of academic and medical erasure. When Western historians of science compiled the definitive timeline of public health and epidemiology, they executed a massive, deliberate historical blind spot. They drew a straight, unbroken line from the ancient Greek physicians directly to Girolamo Fracastoro in Italy, completely skipping over the centuries of highly advanced, heavily documented, and empirically flawless Islamic medicine. They took Ibn al-Khatib, a man who had literally stared the Black Death in the face, completely rejected superstition, and mathematically proven how the apocalypse was spreading. and they systematically scrubbed his name from the medical curriculum. This massive, highly successful historical erasure set the perfect stage for the ultimate scientific heist. By the time the modern era arrived, the West had completely convinced itself that they were the undisputed pioneers of rational medicine. Let us look at the legendary physicians of the Italian Renaissance and Victorian Europe, universally worshipped by Western textbooks as the absolute gods of epidemiology. We are told that their realizations of contagion and physical transmission were completely isolated, uniquely Western intellectual miracles. Western history treats the European conquest of disease as an unprecedented leap in human evolution. But if you actually look at the conceptual framework of their public health mandates, the illusion of an entirely new medical science completely evaporates. The fundamental realization that a deadly plague is not a divine curse, that disease spreads strictly through direct human contact, that inanimate objects carry infection, and that physical quarantine is the absolute only way to stop a pandemic, is the exact fundamental concept that Ibn al-Khatib established in Granada centuries prior. Girolamo Fracastoro and the European pioneers of medicine did not invent the concept of contagion. They were undeniably brilliant doctors who later expanded upon these ideas and eventually verified them under microscopes. But they did not discover the mechanics of transmission. They simply applied the exact clinical blueprints that Andalusian physicians had already written, populated it with European terminology, packaged it for a Western audience, and passed the core concept off as the spontaneous invention of the Italian Renaissance. The Western pioneers of public health were undeniably powerful in their later applications, but they were not the original architects of epidemiology. They were the inheritors of a massive, heavily translated, highly advanced Islamic medical legacy. The Western medical establishment did not discover the mechanics of contagion out of thin air. They simply copied the Andalusian clinical observations, used that exact framework to survive the subsequent plagues, and then had the absolute arrogance to claim they had invented the concept of public health itself. Do you see the absolute arrogance of the heist? First, they actively translated and absorbed the clinical observations of the Islamic world into their own early medical universities. Then, they used that exact empirical framework to structure their own quarantine laws and theories of physical transmission. And finally, when the brilliance of the system became the undisputed foundation of global survival, they simply erased the Andalusian physician from the timeline of human discovery, passing off his genius as the miraculous invention of European intellect. They took the absolute foundation of epidemiology, smashed the Arabic name off the hospital wing, and slapped a European patent on human survival. They built the modern centers for disease control on a stolen blueprint. Today, we live in a world completely dictated by these medical laws. We build massive, multi-billion-dollar health organizations. We wear protective equipment. We isolate the infected. We track the spread of pathogens. And we burn contaminated materials, relying entirely on the clinical, empirical understanding of direct physical contagion. We sit in university medical schools and nod along as professors praise the unique, unparalleled, isolated genius of the Renaissance and the birth of Western medicine. We are told that the West alone crawled out of the darkness of miasma theory, took off the terrifying bird masks, and figured out how to safely navigate the mechanics of a pandemic. But the modern epidemiological mind was not born in a laboratory in Paris or Florence. The mechanical reality of contagion was not discovered in the 16th century. The absolute foundation of public health, the physical transmission of disease, the identification of fomites, and the proven immunity of isolated populations was entirely awakened, shaped, and permanently defined by an Islamic polymath in the 14th century. Modern epidemiology is not a spontaneous European miracle. It is a massive, highly successful medical heist. The West didn't discover how diseases spread. They simply watched an Islamic physician prove it during the apocalypse, copied his empirical notes, and then convinced the rest of the planet that they had invented medical rationality itself. Everything you just heard is documented. The massive, undeniable physical reality of Ibn al-Khatib's 14th century treatise, On the Plague, is sitting right there in the historical archives. The exact, flawless clinical articulation of contagion, transmission through garments, and the absolute rejection of the ancient Greek miasma theory, centuries before Europe even understood the concept, is an undisputed historical fact. The undeniable existence of European medical universities, heavily relying on Islamic medical frameworks before claiming the discoveries for themselves, is a matter of absolute physical record. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is the true father of epidemiology and contagion deliberately kept out of your medical textbook? If this completely shattered how you see the history of medicine, the conquest of disease, and the myth of Western scientific supremacy, Share it with someone who needs to hear this. The Buried Record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.